Everyone thinks they understand what's happening here. A trade threat, a tough tweet, another round of Trump's saber rattling toward Canada. It feels familiar, almost boring in its predictability. But that's exactly why this moment matters more than it seems. Because underneath the noise, this isn't really about airplanes or certification paperwork or even Canada. It's about how power actually moves in the modern global economy, who gets to weaponize bureaucracy, and why Trump keeps returning to tariffs as his blunt instrument of choice, even when the target looks strange. If you're confused by why a U.S. president would threaten tariffs on Canadian aircraft over a certification dispute involving an American jet manufacturer, that confusion is warranted. The story sounds upside down. Usually, it's foreign companies complaining about U.S. regulators. Usually, it's America defending its domestic industries from outside competition. Here, Trump is claiming that Canada's aviation regulators are effectively blocking the sale of American made Gulfstream jets. And his response isn't to take the dispute quietly through regulatory channels or even trade courts, but to threaten a sweeping 50% tariff on every aircraft Canada sells into the United States. Commercial jets, business jets, everything. On the surface, this feels like classic Trump. Loud, maximalist, deliberately provocative. A truth social post written to dominate the news cycle, to force a response, to signal strength to supporters who like the image of a president who hits back immediately. But if you stop there, you miss the deeper pattern. Trump doesn't use tariffs because he misunderstands how trade works. He uses tariffs because he understands something many politicians avoid saying out loud. In a world where formal institutions move slowly, economic threats move fast, and speed is power. The aviation industry is one of the most regulated, politically sensitive sectors on Earth. Aircraft certification isn't just about safety, even though that's how it's framed publicly. It's about national prestige, industrial policy, and geopolitical leverage. Countries don't just certify planes, they signal trust, reliability, and alignment. When a regulator decertifies or refuses to certify an aircraft, the economic consequences ripple outward instantly. Orders stall, financing dries up, airlines hesitate, entire supply chains feel the shock, and Trump knows this. That's why this dispute landed exactly where it did. Gulfstream isn't just any manufacturer. It's a symbol of American high-end manufacturing tied to defense contractors, private aviation, and elite corporate travel. Bombardier, its Canadian rival, plays a similar role north of the border. These companies aren't merely selling planes, they're embedded in national identity and economic strategy. When Canada moves on certification, even for technical reasons, it's interpreted in Washington not just as a regulatory decision, but as an industrial challenge. Trump's response reframes the issue instantly. He isn't arguing about engineering standards or testing protocols. He's arguing about fairness, reciprocity, and retaliation. If Canada can use its regulatory process to block American products, he's saying, then the United States can use its market power to block Canadian ones. It's transactional logic, stripped of diplomacy, delivered in public instead of behind closed doors. And crucially, it puts pressure not on regulators, but on companies, workers, and investors who suddenly have skin in the fight. This is where the story starts to widen, because the threat doesn't just hit Bombardier. Hundreds of Canadian-made aircraft are operating in or flying into the United States at any given moment. U.S. airlines rely on these jets. Supply chains cross borders constantly. The White House later clarified that existing aircraft wouldn't be affected, only new ones, but even that reassurance comes with a chill. In industries like aviation, uncertainty alone can freeze decisions. No airline wants to place an order if certification could become a political football overnight. Canada's response has been calm, almost deliberately boring. Transport officials emphasize safety, communication, and cooperation. The Prime Minister pushes back on Trump's broader tariff threats, especially the demand that Canada sever trade ties with China. The message is stability, reliability. We follow rules. We don't negotiate under threat. But that calm tone doesn't mean the stakes are low. It means Canada understands something else too. Escalation is exactly what Trump wants, because escalation shifts the battlefield onto terrain where he feels strongest. This is the deeper truth most coverage misses. Trump's tariff threats aren't random bursts of anger. They're part of a worldview where economics replaces diplomacy and leverage replaces consensus. Certification, trade deals, tariffs, even alliances become tools in a continuous negotiation where nothing is ever fully settled. And once you see that, this airplane dispute stops looking like an odd headline and starts looking like a preview of how Trump would govern again, not just with Canada, but with everyone. Because the real question isn't whether a 50% aircraft tariff ever actually happens. The real question is what happens to global systems when every technical disagreement becomes a political weapon and every market becomes a pressure point. And that question is only just beginning to unfold. To understand why this tactic keeps resurfacing, you have to step back from the headline and look at how Trump sees institutions. He has never trusted them, especially when they sit outside direct political control. Regulatory agencies, international trade bodies, multilateral agreements. To Trump, these aren't neutral arbiters, they're obstacles, slow moving, overly cautious, captured by experts who don't answer to voters and who, in his view, too often disadvantage American companies in the name of process. Certification regimes fit perfectly into that suspicion. They're technical, opaque, and incredibly powerful, which makes them ideal targets for political pressure. Aviation certification is a prime example. In theory, it's about safety standards that are harmonized across countries so planes can fly freely across borders. In practice, it's also a gatekeeping mechanism. If your regulator doesn't recognize another country's certification, aircraft can't be sold, leased, or operated easily. That's why these decisions are usually insulated from politics. Once politicians start leaning on regulators, trust erodes fast. And trust is the currency that keeps global aviation functioning. Trump is willing to spend that trust. He always has been. During his first term, tariffs weren't a last resort, they were a first move. Steel, aluminum, washing machines, solar panels. The pattern was consistent. Identify an industry where American producers feel squeezed. Frame the issue as unfair treatment by foreign actors. Move fast and loud with tariffs. Force negotiations under pressure. Whether the policy worked in a traditional economic sense was almost beside the point. The political value came from action, confrontation, and the appearance of control. What makes the aircraft dispute different is that it drags a deeply technical system into that same logic. Certification disputes normally play out quietly between agencies, with years of testing, documentation, and appeals. Trump bypasses all of that with a single threat: recertify our products or lose access to our market. It's a move designed not to convince regulators, but to panic stakeholders, airlines, manufacturers, financiers, and even regional governments suddenly have an incentive to push for a resolution, not because the technical issue is solved, but because the economic cost of delay is too high. That's also why the Federal Aviation Administration looms so large here, even though Trump doesn't directly control it day to day. The FAA's authority to certify and decertify aircraft gives it enormous influence, but it also makes it a potential pressure valve. Trump's public suggestion that Canadian aircraft could be decertified in the U.S. signals to everyone watching that no regulatory decision is off limits if it becomes politically inconvenient. That alone can change behavior, even if nothing formally changes on paper. The ripple effects extend well beyond aviation. Other countries are watching closely. If Canada, one of America's closest allies, can be threatened with sweeping tariffs over a certification dispute, then no partner is immune. It reinforces a lesson that many governments learned during Trump's first term. Agreements and norms offer limited protection when the U.S. president is willing to override them with executive power and public pressure. The safer move, from their perspective, is to reduce exposure to U.S. leverage wherever possible. This is where the China angle enters the picture and why it's not a random add-on. Trump's warning that Canada could face a 100% tariff unless it cuts a trade deal with China isn't really about Canada's China policy. It's about enforcing alignment. In Trump's worldview, economic relationships are hierarchical. Allies are expected to follow Washington's lead, especially in strategic competition with Beijing. When they don't, tariffs become the enforcement mechanism. Canada's refusal is telling. By saying it won't enter into a trade deal with a non-market economy while also defending its existing engagement with China, Ottawa is trying to walk a narrow line. It wants to appear cooperative without surrendering autonomy, but that balancing act is increasingly hard to sustain in a world where economic ties are being recast as security threats. Trump's approach accelerates that pressure, forcing countries to choose sides more explicitly and more quickly than they might prefer. Domestically, this plays well for Trump. Polling consistently shows that while Americans are divided on trade policy details, there's broad skepticism about globalization and a strong appetite for leaders who promise to protect domestic industries. Aviation workers, defense-linked manufacturers, and regional economies tied to aerospace production hear a simple message. He's willing to fight for you, even if it means picking a fight with a friendly neighbor. What gets lost is the cost. Tariffs don't just punish foreign producers, they raise prices, disrupt supply chains, and invite retaliation. In aviation, those costs compound fast. Planes are long-term investments. Delays and uncertainty can push airlines to cancel routes, defer expansion, or shift orders to other manufacturers entirely. The irony is that a move meant to protect American industry can, over time, make the entire ecosystem more fragile. And yet, fragility isn't necessarily a deterrent for Trump. In many ways, it's leverage. When systems are stable, power is diffuse. When systems are stressed, those who can tolerate disruption gain an advantage. Trump's willingness to inject uncertainty is not a bug in his strategy, it's the feature. And as this dispute drags on, it becomes less about who certifies which jet and more about how much disruption each side is willing to absorb to defend its position. By the time you get to this point, the argument starts to flip. The question stops being whether Trump's threat is justified and becomes whether the system he's challenging can actually withstand this kind of pressure. Because aviation, like trade more broadly, only works when most participants agree to restrain themselves. It's a high-trust environment built on the assumption that technical decisions stay technical, that safety standards aren't bargaining chips, and that disputes are handled through slow, boring processes most people never notice. Trump is effectively stress testing that assumption in real time. What's striking is how little room there is for error. Aviation regulators don't have the luxury of being wrong or even appearing political. If Transport Canada caves too quickly, it undermines its credibility as an independent safety authority. If the FAA signals that certification can be influenced by presidential pressure, it risks the same thing. Once that credibility erodes, airlines, insurers, and foreign regulators start questioning whether certifications mean what they used to mean. That doubt doesn't stay contained, it spreads. This is why industry reaction matters more than official statements. Airlines don't speak loudly, but they react decisively. Fleet planning happens years in advance, and decisions are based on risk management as much as price. If U.S. carriers begin to suspect that Canadian aircraft could become entangled in political disputes, they may quietly shift future orders elsewhere, even if tariffs never materialize. The same logic applies in reverse. Canadian firms may start hedging against U.S. market access, investing more heavily in Europe or Asia to dilute risk. None of this shows up immediately in headlines, but it reshapes the industry over time. There's also a domestic political layer that complicates everything. Trump's base tends to see regulators as part of an unaccountable elite, which makes attacks on certification bodies resonate. The idea that foreign bureaucrats are blocking American products fits neatly into a broader narrative of victimization and unfairness. It doesn't matter whether the certification issues are legitimate. What matters is that Trump positions himself as the only one willing to fight back, to cut through red tape with force. For Democrats and more traditional Republicans, this creates a trap. Defending regulatory independence sounds abstract and elitist, especially when framed against job losses or industrial decline. But endorsing Trump's approach risks normalizing the politicization of safety and standards, so the response tends to be muted, procedural, cautious. That silence, in turn, reinforces Trump's framing. He acts, others explain. He threatens, others reassure. In modern politics, that asymmetry often favors the aggressor. Media coverage plays a role here, too. Headlines focus on the shock value of a 50% tariff or a 100% threat tied to China, but rarely linger on the mechanics of certification or the institutional consequences. That makes the story feel like another episode in Trump's long-running trade drama rather than a structural shift in how economic power is wielded. Viewers are trained to expect escalation, outrage, and then some form of compromise. What they're not trained to watch for is erosion. And erosion is the real risk, not a sudden collapse, not planes grounded overnight, but a slow weakening of norms. Each time a regulatory decision is challenged with economic punishment, it becomes slightly harder for the next regulator to claim neutrality. Each time a tariff threat replaces negotiation, it becomes easier to justify doing it again. Over time, the exception becomes the rule. There's an international feedback loop, too. Other governments learn from this behavior. If the U.S. can leverage market access to influence certification outcomes, why shouldn't they? If trade and regulation are openly weaponized, then restraint starts to look like weakness. That's how you end up with a world where safety standards diverge, duplication increases, and trust fragments along geopolitical lines. Planes still fly, but the system supporting them becomes less efficient, more expensive, and more politicized. Ironically, this undermines one of Trump's stated goals: American dominance. U.S. influence in global aviation has historically come from leadership, not coercion. When other countries trust U.S. certification, they align their standards accordingly. When that trust fades, alternatives emerge. Europe, already eager to assert regulatory autonomy, gains ground. Emerging markets develop parallel systems. The U.S. market remains powerful, but less central. And yet, from Trump's perspective, that long term drift may feel abstract compared to the immediate gain. A tariff threat forces a conversation now. It rallies supporters now. It signals toughness now. Politics rewards the visible and the immediate far more than the subtle and the delayed. That's the tension at the heart of this dispute. The costs are diffuse and slow. The benefits are concentrated and fast. As the standoff continues, the players are boxed in by their own incentives. Canada must defend the integrity of its aviation system without provoking further retaliation. U.S. regulators must appear independent while operating under a president who thrives on public pressure. Companies on both sides must plan for uncertainty they didn't create. And Trump, true to form, must keep escalating or risk looking like he blinked. What started as a certification dispute has now become a test case, not just for aviation policy, but for whether complex global systems can survive leadership that treats disruption as a negotiating tool. And that test isn't over. In fact, it's only moving into its most revealing phase. By this stage, it becomes clear that the real battle isn't happening in public at all. Behind the scenes, lawyers, lobbyists, and trade officials are scrambling to find off-ramps that don't look like surrender. Everyone involved understands the danger of letting this escalate too far, but nobody wants to be seen as the one who gave in. That's the paradox of Trump's approach. It forces urgency while punishing compromise. The moment someone backs down, the precedent is set, and future threats become even more potent. For the aviation companies caught in the middle, this is a familiar nightmare. They are global by necessity, but national by perception. Bombardier may sell jets worldwide, but it's still seen as a Canadian champion. Gulfstream, owned by a major U.S. defense contractor, is tightly intertwined with American industrial and security interests. When these firms become symbols, their technical disputes take on political weight they never asked for. Certification delays or denials stop being engineering problems and start being interpreted as hostile acts. What makes this especially dangerous is that safety regulation doesn't tolerate shortcuts. You can't simply wave a plane through certification without risking lives. Regulators know this, and so do the companies, which is why they're desperate to keep politics at arm's length. But once a president publicly frames certification as economic warfare, the pressure becomes unavoidable. Even if the final decision is technically sound, the perception of influence lingers. The White House clarification that existing Canadian-made aircraft won't be affected is revealing in its own way. It shows an awareness of how disruptive a full decertification would be. Grounding hundreds of planes overnight would be catastrophic economically and politically, so the threat is carefully scoped, aggressive enough to scare, but limited enough to avoid immediate chaos. That balance is intentional. It maximizes leverage while minimizing blowback, at least in the short term. Still, even limited threats change behavior. Airlines factor political risk into contracts. Financiers demand higher returns to compensate for uncertainty. Insurers raise premiums. Over time, these costs add up, and they don't stay neatly contained within national borders. Passengers pay more, routes get cut, smaller operators struggle. None of that is visible in a true social post, but it's felt across the system. This also intersects with a broader shift in how economic statecraft is practiced. Tariffs used to be blunt tools deployed sparingly. Now they're signaling devices, bargaining chips, and domestic political theater all at once. Trump's genius, for lack of a better word, is recognizing how much attention and fear a single number attached to a tariff can generate. 50%, 100%. The scale is part of the message. It tells everyone involved that normal limits don't apply. Canada's leadership understands this, which is why its public posture is so restrained. Emphasizing safety, reliability, and communication isn't just diplomatic politeness, it's a strategic choice. By refusing to match Trump's tone, Canada avoids escalating the spectacle. It also appeals to international audiences who still value predictability. But restraint has its own risks. It can look like weakness, especially in a media environment that rewards confrontation. There's also the looming question of domestic politics inside Canada. Aerospace jobs matter there too. If bombardier workers start feeling the impact of delayed orders or canceled contracts, pressure on the government will grow. At that point, the dispute becomes not just a bilateral issue, but a domestic political problem on both sides of the border. That's when leaders are most tempted to double down, to frame compromise as betrayal. The China dimension continues to hover in the background, shaping everything. Trump's insistence that allies align economically against Beijing turns every trade relationship into a loyalty test. Canada's refusal to fully disengage from China reflects economic reality as much as principle, but it also makes Canada a target. In Trump's worldview, neutrality isn't neutral, it's obstruction. All of this feeds into a larger transformation of the global order. Institutions that once absorbed conflict are being bypassed. Disputes that might have taken years to resolve quietly are now detonated publicly. The pace accelerates, but the margin for error shrinks. When leaders treat complex systems like aviation as leverage points, they risk breaking mechanisms that took decades to build. At this point, the aircraft themselves almost fade into the background. They become symbols, hostages in a larger struggle over who sets the rules and how forcefully those rules are enforced. And as this story moves toward its conclusion, the most important question isn't whether Canada recertifies Gulfstream or whether tariffs are imposed. It's what kind of economic world emerges when threats become the default language of negotiation. What makes the ending of this story so unsettling is that there's no clean resolution waiting at the end of it. There's no obvious winner, no decisive policy victory that restores balance and lets everyone move on. Instead, what you get is normalization, another threat absorbed, another line crossed without immediate catastrophe, another reminder that the rules everyone assumed were fixed are, in fact, flexible if you're powerful enough and loud enough to bend them.